we're starting with Vasé Alavi, if I pronounce it right, who will be talking about accepting the illogical, self-communication and transition from personal to societal in Bernardo Bertolucci's The Dreamers. Vasé, you can share your screen with us.
Thank you, and hello to all. Let me share my screen. Right. Okay. So the title of my speech today is Accepting the Illogical, and I am using Bernardo Bertolucci's film The Dreamers to explicate my point. The problem of communication, I believe, is or should be one of the fundamental concerns when imagining utopian possibilities. Therefore, using the theory of pragmatics of communication proposed by the Finnish British critic Roger D. Sell, in combination with the two concepts of anima and animus in Carl Gustav Jung's theory of collective unconscious, I have tried to speculate about the transition from self-communication to communication with one's setting in general. In order to do so, Bernardo Bertolucci's film The Dreamers is chosen here as an illustrative instance of such a transition. Early into the narrative of The Dreamers, Mathieu, the American student who has come to Paris for a year to study French, describes his and his peers, the ones he names insatiables, experience with cinema as being screened from the world. They moreover want to sit at the first rows to get the images firsthand. This screening yourself with zeal from the world and trying to have first-hand untainted experiences is an early analogy in the film hinting at an attempt at self-communication. However, the world always breaks through the screen. In 1968, controversy arises around a change in the management of the Cinémathèque Française, adding a societal aspect to the experience of Mathieu and his peers. One of the possible functions of art is helping in imagining the seemingly impossible, the seemingly illogical. One of these ostensibly impossibles is achieving a balance or a communication between the contradictions and paradoxes that we face in our identity as human beings. In many works of art, we can see the realization of such a communication and harmony. In order to explicate the process of achieving such a communication between contradictory aspects in oneself, we can get help from the concepts of anima and animus in Carl Gustav Jung's theory of collective unconscious. Regarding anima and animus, we should first remember that Jung wrote at a time with more rigid gender perceptions. Therefore, although he mostly refers to anima and animus as hidden unconscious forces in men and women respectively, it does not have to be gender specific, and at least for the purposes of the current discussion, it is presumed that they both, to a greater or lesser extent, exist simultaneously in every person of every gender. With this presumption in mind, Jung's viewpoint on these concepts in two of his quotations seems helpful to the current discussion. First, that anima and animus manifest themselves most typically in the irrationalities of a man's feeling and a woman's thinking. Second, that the animus likes to project itself upon intellectuals and all kinds of heroes, including tenors, artists, sporting celebrities, etc., whereas the anima has a predilection for everything that is unconscious, dark, equivocal, and at a loose end in woman. Therefore, for the purposes of this discussion, it seems reasonable to regard anima as a metaphor for all that seems illogical in our perceived inner identity, and animus as a stand-in for all its logical aspects. It should be noted, however, that what I aim for here by using the concepts of anima and animus is give the audience a somewhat familiar cue to what I am talking about when I talk about the logical and the illogical aspects of one's inner identity, and not to evoke a strict definition of these two concepts in Jung's thought. Furthermore, I believe that these two concepts, anima and animus, as repurposed here, are present in every one of us and sensed in the two broad categories of the perceived logical and illogical streaks of identity that we feel in ourselves. Therefore, these two aspects in human beings can broadly encompass the contradictions and paradoxes mentioned. With these concepts in mind, we can consider the metaphorical roles of the three main characters of this film, Matteo, and the siblings Isabel and Theo. In this regard, for the most part of the film, we can categorize Isabel's and Theo's idiosyncrasies as manifestations of anima and animus respectively, Isabel and Theo supposedly being twins, and in the words of Theo's Siamese twins, reinforces this analogy. With regard to Isabel, anima, we come across many instances which showcase the illogical aspect of her conduct. Therefore, her character is seen as a stand-in for the concept of anima in the current discussion. As a first instance of her anima-motivated behavior, we can mention a scene depicting the protests around the Cinémathèque Française controversy. Matthew sees that Isabel has chained herself to some metal bars, but then he finds out that it is an act, and the chains are actually loose, and Isabel's stern demeanor only a pretense. Isabel is not taking the reality of the protests seriously. She is merely acting, which is against the conventional logic of the moment. In another instance, the three characters have almost run out of food and money. Therefore, Isabel cooks them a meal with what is left and burns it. Nonetheless, she offers them to Theo and Matthew as if the meal is actually digestible. She tells Matthew, "Eat it as if you were in some exotic country you've never visited before, and this is the national dish." She is contesting the logical observation that the meal is burned and not fit for serving. Likewise, when Matthew asks her what happens if the siblings' parents find out about their unconventional relationship, for example, lying naked with each other at night, Isabel does not even want to think about this possibility. And after repeating several times that it must never happen, she says that in the event of such an outcome, I will kill myself. In another scene which gives us a counterpart in Theo's reaction to the same stimulus of reality, when the three of them come in the house soaked from the rain outside, the phone rings. The siblings assume that it is their parents. Isabel's reaction is that she is too wet to answer, a seemingly nonsensical reason for ignoring the phone call. Theo, however, starts to talk about the need for their parents' generation to be subjected to self-criticism and re-education after being put to trial to confess their crimes. Similar to the response to the phone call, Theo Animus seems to be the one among the siblings relying more heavily on logic. We first see this in the scene of his argument with his father when Matthew is invited to have dinner with the family. The father is critical of the protests by the young generation and their hope not only to provoke society, but also to transform it. Theo reminds his father of his own past writings and reproaches him for what he has become. All through this argument, Isabel seems to be bored and only faking some interest, similar to when she was pretending to have chained herself to the bars in front of the Cinémathèque Française. She even seems to yawn at one point. Moreover, in a later scene, when Matthew and Isabel are having sex for the first time, provoked by Theo, he starts making some eggs for a meal. A very peculiar move when we think of the two others having sex just across the kitchen. Also in the scene where Isabel has made some burnt meal for the three of them and they finally find it inedible, Theo is the one going in search of some more appropriate meal by searching in the garbage just outside their apartment building. Halfway through the film, we see Matthew expressing his gratitude to Theo for letting him be a part of them, saying that you're like two halves of the same person. Now you've made me feel like I'm a part of you, a somewhat poetic turn of phrase. This, at least for Theo, hints at a somewhat fatalistic view, to which he responds by saying that although he likes Matthew, but no, it wasn't always meant to be the three of us. Then he reminds Matthew that he wasn't joking when he said he and Isabel are Siamese twins, a statement which reminds us, the viewers, that although for the most part the siblings metaphorically play the roles of anima and animus, more usually people cannot be defined solely by either logical or illogical traits. Matthew's metaphorical role in the film can be seen as the ground of contention between anima and animus. He is a cinephile engaging, as described in the beginning of this discussion, in a kind of self-communication with the help of the screen between him and the world outside. He dances alone in the hall of his hotel, and later he tries to taste The burnt food that Isabel has prepared with the image of the national dish of an exotic country in mind, unconventional moves of sort reminding us of anima. Yet he is shocked at first when he sees the siblings sleeping naked beside each other. It is not acceptable to the conventional logic that forms part of his identity. He, however, tries not to judge them to an extent that would make communication between the three impossible. He tries to empathize and understand what is happening here. He tries to keep an open mind, and in the words of Roger D. Sell, and in the words that Roger D. Sell borrows from Gadamer in explicating his own theory of pragmatics of communication, Matthew engages in an act of self-discovery through self-alienation, which is to recognize one's own in the alien, to become at home in it, as the basic movement of a spirit whose being consists only in returning to itself from what is other. He engages in their games and, for instance, runs with them in the halls of Louvre to recreate a scene in the 1964 French film Band of Outsiders. He is anxious about doing this. He is a foreigner, an alien, and should they get caught, he will be deported. But he accepts the challenge when Isabel, in another illogical argument, says that the actors in the film were not caught, so they will not be either. As a result, he gradually accepts the siblings' relationship too, and is even grateful for being a part of it. However, self-communication is not our sole lived experience. Roger D. Sell believes that all humans are social individuals. In this view, the human being is seen as in no small part socially conditioned, yet as nevertheless having a certain mental, imaginative, ethical, and temperamental individuality and autonomy. The social aspect of our identity cannot be ignored. Therefore, when in one of their games the siblings want Matthew to prove his love by shaving his pubic hair, he protests, "Think about it, think. I wish you could step out of yourselves and just look. I look at you and I listen to you and I think you're never gonna grow. You won't grow like this, you won't." And he invites Isabel on a real date, which she accepts, and they go out for drinks and watching a film at the cinema. This time they go to the cinema as a couple on a date, sitting in the back rows because the front is for people who don't have dates. In this way, the personal sphere is distinguished from the societal. Transition from the personal to societal, however, is not an easy task. Therefore, when they go back to the apartment and Isabel finds out that Theo is in the other room with another girl, she throws a tantrum and wants Theo back, and Matthew leaves her for the night. Regardless of this emotional hardship, however, she finally goes to sleep in her bedroom. The bedroom is a symbol of her personal sphere, with everything very tidy and innocent and with teddy bears on the pillows, a kind of fantasy world. It is in this way that Isabel's waking the next morning in a somewhat messy room with the teddy bears on the floor finds a meaning. A transition is happening indeed. The protests of 1968 are in motion throughout the film. When Matthew and Isabel are having sex and Theo is cooking, he watches the riots down in the street for some moments, and most of the times when they go out, the film depicts these protests that are happening around the personal story of the three. Finally, when the siblings' parents come home and find them sleeping in a tent with Matthew all naked, they leave a check for them and get out. Isabel wakes up and finds out that her parents were there. She, as she had announced earlier, decides to kill herself along with Theo and Matthew. However, as she is lying in the tent with the other two holding a gas hose near their noses, a brick shatters a window to their apartment and the reality of the streets rushes into the room. Isabel hides the hose before the other two find out, and the three of them go out into the streets. By now, the three of them have engaged in an act of self-communication and to a great extent have come to terms with the illogical part of their inner identity as well as the logical. They have also tried with difficulty to experience the societal aspect of their existence. Now comes the time for them to each choose their own path. Theo wants to join the protests, Isabel joins Theo, and Matthew leaves them and the protests. The divergent paths of Matthew and the siblings reminds us that the outcome of communicational acts is not always a consensus. Just as in self-communication, neither the anima nor the animus can be ignored and suppressed completely for the sake of the other, in communication with one setting too, we cannot aim for total agreements, but a more realistic goal is to try for Habermas's reasonable disagreement, empathizing with one's different aspects of a perceived self and accepting the contradictions and paradoxes and the perceived illogicalities we find in ourselves can be a roadmap for our responses to the differences in others. A perfect utopia and a perfect utopian experience might not be attainable, but as my MA thesis professor Dr. Alireza Umidbakhsh taught me, between a utopian vision and the current state of affairs, there is always a possible state, and that, I believe, is what we should aim for when thinking about utopian possibilities. Thank you.
Vasé, thank you very much for an inspiring paper. We will discuss it at the end with questions, thanks to all the claps from the audience. You've been really, really good with time as well, so hopefully we'll have more time for discussion.